Before we start the seminar today, I would like to briefly introduce the pioneering series of lectures organized by Sebastian Liao Xianhao, who is the Dean of the Advanced Studies for Social Sciences and Humanity. And the core issues for the series to cover, there are three issues. The first one I remember should be humanities between migration and hybridity. And the second one is between humanities between traditions and modernity. And the third one is between science and technology. Yeah, Professor Liao, he personally thinks like today's topic will cover migration and hybridity, but I think it will cover all three dimensions. So the Institute will welcome everybody to take part of our future lectures and workshops. So now I hand over to Professor Fejic. Yeah.
Okay. On behalf of the Department of Political Science and National Taiwan University, we are honored and delighted to have Mr. Goran Fejic to give a presentation here. Okay. Let me give a very brief introduction for Mr. Fejic. He was trained in economics and got a degree from the Zagreb Faculty of Economic Sciences. And so, some of you may know, Zagreb is the current capital of the Croatian Republic, okay, on the Balkan Peninsula. Mr. Fejic was a diplomat of the former Yugoslavia when it began to get disintegrated, okay. He was posted in Rome, Geneva, and New York, and for the United Nations General Assembly meetings until 1991, when he chose to resign from the post of the diplomat because of the warmongering politics by nationalist leaders in different republics of the former Yugoslavia. Then he joined the United Nations in his personal capacity and worked as a coordinator in several peacekeeping and peacebuilding, electoral and human rights missions across the world. He was in countries such as Haiti, South Africa, Guatemala, and Afghanistan. From 2005 to 2011, when he retired, he worked as a senior advisor in the Policy and Strategy Unit of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He's now living in the capital of France, in the city of Paris. Okay, and today he's going to speak on the topic of the demise of state multilateralism in a multipolar world and why. So let's look at Mr. Fejic.
Good morning, friends. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Sebastian Liao for having invited me and made it possible for me to meet you. And to thank you, Professor Philip Xu, for having so gladly accepted to moderate this talk. And in fact, your nice introduction allowed me to skip a confession that I wanted to make, and I'll say it anyway. The fact that I'm not a scholar, a real scholar. I'm more what you would call a practitioner in international relations. Still, I somehow, Professor Sebastian Liao thought that my story could somehow be interesting to you. So I'll go ahead with the story. And I have suggested for today's talk, this topic, the demise of state multilateralism in a multipolar world, and perhaps it will become clearer at the end of my talk why I put this state, why I added the word state and put it in brackets. Why? I've been intrigued for some time by this strange fact that 30 years after the end of the Cold War, instead of an inclusive multilateralism, that is to say, a free acknowledgement of the interdependence of the world and coming together for the common benefit, we have something which is totally different on the international scene. We have something that could be described as prevailing unilateralism, confusion, and in some cases even chaos. Why? Quickly, perhaps we should define the terms that we are using. By Cold War, of course, we understand that period between the end of the Second World War and 1989, when the dominant feature of international relations was the division of the world into antagonistic blocks, a kind of frozen geopolitical landscape, frozen by threat and frozen by fear, the threat and the fear of mutual nuclear annihilation. This definition of the Cold War is not perfect, and it's not perfect for several reasons. First, because the bipolarity, though dominant, was far from being total. The bipolarity was challenged as of the mid-50s by the emergence on the international scene of important new actors, former colonies such as India, Indonesia, Arab and African countries, which first gathered, as you know, in Bandung in 1955, then in Belgrade in 1961, where they established the movement of the non-aligned countries, the group which grew steadily and became a majority group in the United Nations, that did not have the economic hegemony, but could still challenge and, in a way, indent this dominant bipolarity, but we shall come back to that. Second, the definition is not perfect because the war was far from being a cold one everywhere. It was relatively cold, quote unquote, in Europe, to some extent in North America and the space that we call today Eurasia, but it was fully fledged and burning and deadly in Asia and Africa. This is a picture from the Vietnam War, and suffice to mention the wars in Korea and Vietnam, the wars of national liberation in Africa. Well, in Latin America, we had the bloody CIA-led coup d'etat. Even in Europe, where the backyards of the two superpowers were more clearly defined by the Yalta agreements, conflicts would still occasionally erupt, and some blood would be shed before the bipolar Yalta order would be re-established. Let us recall the uprising in Hungary in 1956, the reform attempts in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and both ended with Soviet military intervention. The uprisings in France in '68, the bombs exploding in trains and on squares in Italy in the '70s, etc. But none of these eruptions really, or simmering internal conflicts, went far enough in Europe to undermine the dominant bipolarity of the world until 1989. And finally, the definition I mentioned earlier is not perfect because, precisely because some remnants of the Cold War did persist after this ominous year of 1989. Let us mention Ukraine today, or Korea, and I don't know if this is a picture from North Korea, I believe, or even Taiwan. I don't know to what extent we can define the interstate relations as a remnant of some sort of remnant of the Cold War. You know that better than I do, of course. What do we understand as multilateralism? obviously it's not just a question of number, how many players you have on the international scene. The term is polysemantic and has its historical evolution, and of course it is mainly about imagining relations between states as determined by some commonly agreed rules rather than by pure force and sovereign will. This is what we would call today, quote unquote, international governance. The idea is an old one. It dates from the French Enlightenment, rationality, envisioning some sort of social contract in international relations, etc. But the fact is that before the 20th century, we did not have any global attempt to establish a system of global governance. The first one that could be named as such was the League of Nations in the 1920s, after 1920s, after the First World War. We know that it ended rather poorly, unable to stop the Nazi and fascist expansion in Europe. But it had its flaws even before. It was never joined by the United States, and the Soviet Union joined very late and was soon expelled after invading Finland. So the best known today and only relatively successful, I could say, attempt to establish a body of global governance is, of course, the United Nations. It's not the only body of international governance, and it's not the only example of multilateralism, far from that, but it is emblematic, if not for other things, then definitely for its very broad mandate, which covers three key objectives: peace, human rights, and social development. And because of its aspiration to universality, I purposely say aspiration and not achieved universality, of course. My view is that multilateralism today is seriously endangered. And paradoxically, it seems to be on a sliding downward slope precisely at a time when it is most needed and when the world may be in the process of becoming truly multipolar. So in order to understand that paradox, I think we have to go back from the creation of the United Nations to nowadays. It is important because the UN is not a simple mirror of its member state, though it is often depicted as such. Being such a large organization, it has its own inertia. And this inertia has sometimes negative, sometimes positive effects. I would say the positive one is in the fact that people working there, very many people, especially people who are in the field, in humanitarian and peacekeeping and such missions, are often inspired to work, keeping in mind the charter and the basic principles rather than what states decide on a day-to-day basis. So there is a kind of positive inertia in that they are able to go beyond what daily politics of states would require them to do. There is also a negative inertia in the sense, for example, that it has been impossible so far to reform one of the main bodies of the United Nations, namely the Security Council, for many, many internal and external reasons. I suggest looking at 5 periods in the post-war history of multilateralism and the UN. The initial years, from 45 to the mid-70s, the period of decolonization and the surge of a more just international economic order from the 60s to the late 70s, the years of what I would call Thatcher Reaganism, beginning, and these are the years I see them as the beginnings of the demise, of the fading out of multilateralism, mid-70s to late 80s, the confusion that followed the end of the Cold War, and that was, in my view, a parallel surge of multilateralism and unilateralism. And we will come later to that, and our current times, which in my view are characterized by more confusion, both institutional and ideological, the rise of populism, and really its toxic effects of multilateralism, anti-institutionalism, sometimes I would also say anti-intellectualism in politics, domestic and international, really. Let us start from the first period. We are in 1945. The world just came out of the horrors of the Second World War, with its massive killings and devastations, the genocide, the material misery, and the moral outrage once the smoke settled. There was a general outcry, never again, and the political expression of that outcry was the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Inspired, emancipatory, almost poetic documents, you could say, and for the same reason so difficult to amend or adjust as time changes. You could almost call them the quote-unquote birth certificates of the international community, the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet soon thereafter, in fact almost simultaneously, with this coming together of nations, you had a deep division of the world in two antagonistic, almost irreconcilable blocks. And the expression of this antagonism was that the Charter was complemented by the procedures of the UN, which allowed for a very unequal position of countries as members of the organization. Some of them, the big ones, the big victors of the Second World War, were endowed with the power to promote and approve legally binding resolutions in the Security Council, or to veto them, the 5 permanent members. So we had an idealism combined with a kind of realpolitik. And this, in a way, was, I think, unavoidable. It is, if you want to keep the big words discussing the key issues in the organization, you have to make concessions to give them what they want, otherwise they take the issue and discuss it elsewhere, as they do today in the G7, the G20, and other such informal groups. The second period, the 60s and 70s, is characterized by a sharp rise in the number of member states. From the 51 funding ones, we came to more than 100. Most new members were decolonized African and Asian states who did not recognize themselves in the Cold War division and aspired to a different world, one that would be free from the nuclear threat, and in which they would be free to choose their political system and to set their developmental priorities. So after the first conference of the non-aligned movement in 1961 in Belgrade, these countries increasingly acted as a kind of pressure group in the United Nations. Old-fashioned colonialism was losing ground. Non-aligned countries supported the national liberation movements in Africa and Asia, taking advantage of the provisions of international law and of one of the key principles of the UN Charter, which is the principle of self-determination. So the numbers started to matter in the UN, regardless of the fact that the resolutions of the General Assembly were devoid of legal force as opposed to those of the Security Council, but still there were mechanisms by which you could circumvent that obstruction. A famous resolution called United for Peace, number 377, etc. The two superpowers, in their zero-sum game, what you lose I gain, what I gain you lose, sought to lure or seduce the non-aligned countries, and indeed managed to engage some of them as their proxies, which is, for example, the case of Cuba for the USSR, or some Gulf states, or some Latin American states for the US. Yet the core group of the non-aligned continued to push for a world that would no longer be divided along these antagonistic blocks. Most importantly, the non-aligned countries became the acting spirit behind what happened to be known as the Group of 77, the developing countries, which decided to pursue the ideal of a more just and more equal international economic order. The group was initially composed of 77 countries, but then grew to more than 134 today, I believe, and constituted itself as a pressure group in many UN organizations, UNCTAD, UNIDO, UNEP, etc. The leading idea of these countries was that the post-colonial economic order should be made less biased in favor of the rich and powerful, that the system of commodity markets, of trade barriers, of finance for development, etc., should not systematically favor the owners of capital and the means of those who possess the means of economic coercion. This idea may seem very naive and a bit incongruous today. Today, you don't any longer discuss economic issues and financial issues in organizations which have a one country, one vote system. But back in the 60s and 70s, this idea of a more just and balanced world seemed credible, was credible, and seemed attainable. And it was also supported advocated by some eminent economists in those times, such as Raúl Prebisch from Argentina, or Celso Furtado from Brazil, or Samir Amin from Egypt. What did this period mean for multilateralism and for the UN? On the one hand, we had the described frozen bipolar world with the dominant powers playing their zero-sum game and seeking to secure their spheres of influence. On the other hand, we had a very powerful undercurrent of these emerging forces, epitomized essentially, but not only, by the non-aligned movement, that kept rocking the boat and using the UN as a tool to promote not only decolonization, but a more kind of progressive international order. that worked to some extent. The old colonial system was dismantled in its geopolitical sense, perhaps much less in the minds of the powerful. But the multilateral dynamics that were set in motion in those times continued for many years to generate and to sustain, in my view, a process of to sustain also the system of multilateralism and the UN. And I think these were really the golden years of the UN and the 20th century multilateralism. And this is only the picture of some of the founders of the UN, President Nehru of India, President Nkrumah of Ghana, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, and President Tito of Yugoslavia. The third period I called the advent of Thatcher Reaganism. This is an old poster from 1981, I think. It's a paraphrase of a poster for a famous old film, Gone with the Wind, with Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh as main actors, while Ronald Reagan is Clark Gable and Margaret Thatcher is Vivian Leigh. It's a very explosive love story. Of course, the arms race continues. The producers are Milton Friedman and the Chicago schools of economists. It's playing the world round, and she promised to follow him to the end of the earth, and he promised to organize it. Now, there's nothing incidental, I think, in the fact that the advent of Thatcher Reaganism in the domestic policies of the leading Western states, the US and the UK, coincided with their continued attempts to downgrade the role and the capacity of the UN. Deregulation was the key word. We know the famous quote of Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as society. It can perfectly be internationalized to read, there is no such thing as international community. Hence, nothing to regulate. Market forces should do their job on both domestic and international markets. Market forces should also dictate what issues should be placed on the agenda and who should be convened to tackle them. Trade issues are limited to tariffs and should be discussed in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later to become the WTO. Likewise, finance should be discussed in the World Bank and the IMF, and the indebtedness of developing countries should be a matter of concern to specific debtors and specific creditors and no one else. The current economic order is the only possible one, the normal way to do business, and successful business is to be carried by successful private entrepreneurs. So states, societies, and international organizations have nothing to do on that matter. Thus, the old East-West divide in the UN got combined with a new North-South divide. The latter would often take the form of protracted and rather inconclusive debates in the General Assembly and other fora such as UNCTAD between developing countries, the Group of 77, and industrialized countries, members of the OECD. Whenever possible, I must say, because I took a part in these negotiations, the group of 77, the developing countries, would seek consensus more than voting against the others, because obviously you cannot vote, or when you do vote on international economic issues, the side which is voted out simply doesn't implement what has been voted. So there's not much sense in voting on economic issues. Seeking consensus through negotiations is much more important, is advisable. That was also the time, I recall that word, that keyword, deregulation, when US and UK diplomacies, as well as those from other developed Western countries, increasingly started looking at the UN and depicting the UN as an overgrown, useless entity that only disturbs the smooth running of businesses and only draws large amount of money from their taxpayers' pockets. So this negative attitude of the US towards the United Nations was particularly awkward if one recalls that President Roosevelt played a key role in the founding of the United Nations and did a lot to convince other Second World War allies, Winston Churchill and Stalin, to join the organization. Yet the most frequent sources of friction within the UN was not in the economic field, but rather in the political one, on the Middle East and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in the sense that the US systematically used its veto power in the Security Council to block resolutions condemning or criticizing Israel. With the advent of Thatcher-Reaganism, the rejection of the demands of developing countries on economic and social issues, coupled with this old animosity generated by the frictions and the criticism of the UN on the Middle East topics. There was a sense already that a sense of incompatibility of a global multilateral organization such as the UN with a unipolar world view and strategy of a superpower. And this attitude had a direct negative effect, of course, on the institutional capacity of the UN, since the US is the largest financial contributor. Earlier it was 25% of the UN budget, subsequently reduced to 22%. The US refused on a number of occasions to pay its UN dues in order to force UN compliance with its policies, and including on the topic of internal, the United Nations reform, essentially on the scaling down of programs of technical assistance for developing countries. And thus we come to the fourth in my periodization, and of course I insist that periodization is very tentative, as periods overlap, and it's always one of the possible views of history, not the necessary absolute one. I think the fourth period comes with the end of the Cold War, and later on with the effects of the so-called Washington Consensus. In the late 80s, President Gorbachev, set rolling his perestroika, and obviously soon it became obvious that this was a major change that was taking place in the Soviet Union. When the change of government in Poland, for example, did not, as some feared, end up with a Soviet invasion, but on the contrary provoked a domino effect in Hungary, then in Czechoslovakia, etc., process, I mean, it became obvious that we have that it's a global tectonic shift, a global breakthrough. The end of the Cold War and the coming down of the Berlin Wall as its symbolic event. As you know, well, some, like the famous or infamous, as you wish, scholar Fukuyama called it the end of history. President George H.W. Bush, in his State of the Union address in '92, said, quote unquote, "By the grace of God, we won the Cold War." Much before that, Gorbachev's advisor, chief advisor Arbatov, reportedly said to his US counterparts, "We are going to do a terrible thing to you. We are going to deprive you of an enemy." Now, how can one win a war when deprived of an enemy is, of course, subject to, to debate. The fact is that the end of the Cold War produced a lot of turmoil. Famous British historian Eric Hobsbawm called it the end of the short 20th century. We can see, for example, from the testimonies gathered by the Russian Nobel Prize winner in literature, Svetlana Alexeyevich, the amount of confusion in people's minds, the amount of uncertainty, of disorientation that this period provoked. But anyway, we had two main interpretations that prevailed. The first is the West won the Cold War, and the second is the world finally came together. And I think that both, of course, were huge oversimplifications, none being completely false and none being completely true. But when translated into a political strategy, both produced far-reaching implications. For example, there were definitely positive, major positive implications. The long civil wars in Central America, for example, lost their dimensions of proxy wars. And you had, as proxy wars, as they ceased to be viewed by the US as a part of their strategy of containment of communism. Insurgent guerrilla movements finally engaged in serious negotiations and reached meaningful peace agreements, as in El Salvador or in Guatemala in the mid-90s. And these processes were, of course, encouraged and supported and monitored by the United Nations. Likewise, the apartheid regime in South Africa lost its prerogative, which it had for a long time, as a barrier against communism. And so this abhorrent nature of apartheid remained naked and undefendable and in Western public opinions, and gradually and peacefully apartheid was dismantled and outlawed, and the process was crowned by the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994, a process which too was supported and to a certain point promoted by the UN. As an example of the recovered capacity of the UN to act, some also cite the fact that the permanent members of the Security Council could finally come together and reach a consensus on an important security issue, the intervention in, when they authorized the American intervention against Iraq in the first Gulf War. I personally don't think this is a very good example. Yes, it is true, Iraq was occupying Kuwait, but the massive bombing and chaos that came out of the intervention, I think cannot really be described as a peacekeeping operation. But anyway, more than anything, it testified of the growing importance of in the UN of the remaining left superpower, and that could be described, I would say, more as a surge of unilateralism than multilateralism. On the other hand, we had an implosion of the socialist regimes in Eastern Europe, and particularly for the former Soviet Union, which of course meant lifting restrictions on individual liberties and political rights, and also meant, but it also meant the demise of any functioning state. And someone said, I cannot remember whose the quote is, but I think it's very good, when you lift the stone of authoritarianism, what you find below, underneath, is not democracy. What you find underneath, before anything, more than anything else, is chaos, confusion, corruption, the disappearance of any social safety nets, and a general frenzy of people to adjust and benefit from the chaos by pillaging through the debris, a kind of primary capital accumulation, which is not to mean that the recovered individual liberties and political freedoms are not important. Yes, they are very much, but democracy and the system of democracy, of elections, of checks and balances, of separation of powers is something that is built over years and decades and is not just, doesn't emerge when you lift the stone of authoritarianism. So in this chaos and insecurity, people look for shelter, and the first very handy refuge available immediately, not much thinking necessary, is identity. National or religious or both coming together. The political space left by ideology was soon reoccupied, reappropriated by nationalism. Nationalism became the source of political legitimacy, and multiple nationalisms, and they are never as happy as they act together, ended up triggering a new type of violent armed conflict in the Caucasus, in the Balkans and elsewhere, the type of conflicts the leading international actors and the UN and the EU also were totally unprepared and unable to deal with. So we have a contradictory geopolitical setting in the early 90s. We have those successful peace processes in Central America, the end of apartheid in Africa, but also new wars in Eurasia and in the Balkans, and never to be forgotten, 94 for Africa is not only the end of apartheid in South Africa, it's also the year of a major genocide, it's the Second World War in Rwanda. So in spite of this disconcerting diversity of situations, the new hegemonic powers, those claiming to have won the Cold War, wanted to believe and to make others believe that we finally came to the bright new world of peace, democracy, and development. And it would be sufficient, according to them, to install everywhere transparent, multi-party regimes, legitimized by free and fair elections, and even more importantly, to make sure that the government apply systematically economic recipes supposed to have generated the prosperity of the developed Western world. All these recipes, without exception, relied on the acknowledgement of the supposedly unfaltering and undebatable virtues of the market forces and private ownership. So a set of policy prescriptions was developed that constituted a standard reform recipe to be applied in all so-called countries in transition, East European and African alike. As if those countries were blank pages with no history, no memory, no experience of their own. And these recipes became the centerpiece of what became really a genuine new ideology known as the Washington Consensus. The name, of course, refers to the city that hosts the three main institutions where such policy advice has been elaborated: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the U.S. Department of Treasury. And this is a schematic picture of the recipes. Thank you. Thank you. Prescriptions included, among other things, a total opening of national economies to global market forces, the privatization of public and state enterprises, the avoidance of fiscal deficits, which most often meant restrictions in public spending for education and health. The implementation of those measures, it goes without saying, was supposed to take place in a liberal, multi-party environment. Yet, if and when free elections happen to bring to the fore government with different social priorities, this new trio of world policemen, international financial institutions, and creditors' clubs applied the necessary pressure so as to minimize deviations from their prescriptions, even if this implied ignoring the political program with which the government won the elections. So the recipes, the economic recipes became, in a way, more important than the electoral process and the fundamental, the basics of multi-party democracy. And the recent, I think, most emblematic case case in point was Greece a couple of years ago, after the accession to power of the Syriza party. Now, these Washington Consensus policies were applied for more than 2 decades. We know their effects, in many cases rather disastrous. The poor African to which such policies were indiscriminately applied experienced economic stagnation, while their social inequalities deepened and poverty spread. At the same time, East Asian countries, where the state continued to play an important role in promoting industrial and social policies, as well as in poverty alleviation, registered an average growth of 5%. And it is not surprising that such policies prompted popular unrest and contributed to the recrudescence of civil wars in the 90s and in the first decade of the new millennium. the effects of the Washington Consensus on world governance were also, I would say, devastating. Institutional power shifted from the United Nations as a global forum based on a one country, one vote principle to international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, and rich country informal groups such as the G7. This is what I would call the demise of true multilateralism in favor of the rule of the few. However, it is not poverty in Africa or rising inequalities in Eastern Europe that triggered doubts in the unfaltering virtues of the perfect free market. Two major events prompted these doubts. First, the 2008 financial crisis administered the strongest blow to the true believers in free markets. And the second event was the geopolitical shift in economic power. The dominance of the West became less pronounced, less obvious. The BRICS and China in particular emerged as the new players with the ability to distort and disrupt the old Bretton Woods system. And smaller countries of the global south, African countries in particular, suddenly realized that they had a choice, that they were no longer, as they saw before, held prisoners of the so-called conditionalities imposed by Washington Consensus policies. They could choose between different investors and creditors and consequently opt for the development of different models, for models they felt more comfortable with. So we also had a shift in economic hegemony entailed by so these shifts in economic hegemony entailed shifts in political influence. And as you know, China doesn't make its investment conditional upon the acceptance of standards in human rights or fight against corruption or protection of minorities or any such things. The new BRICS investors in China come with often longer-term strategic objectives and do not necessarily expect quick returns on their investments. China undertook very important infrastructure and building in road and railroad networks in Africa and Asia. And unlike Europe, it refrained from offering political advice. On the contrary, it came with some politically forthcoming signals for the leaders of African countries, and a typical example of what today people call the Beijing Consensus is this building, which is the headquarters of the African Union organization in Addis Ababa, generously offered and built by China. Where do we stand today? What does the future hold in store? For nearly 2 decades, the United Nations faced financial difficulties and were forced to cut back on important programs in all areas, even as new mandates have arisen. The UN and all its agencies and funds spend about $30 billion a year, which is about $4 for a world inhabitant. A very small sum compared to most government budgets and less than 3% of the world's military spending. It is often pathetic to watch a large and one of the most effective bodies of the UN, the UNHCR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, having to beg, literally to beg donors for money to help rescuing those whose very lives are threatened by war, by religious or nationalistic intolerance, or natural disasters like desertification. What I call the demise of multilateralism has many faces, of course, not only financial. Sometimes it has a foretaste of a new Cold War, like when the US withdraws from the nuclear intermediate nuclear forces treaty with Russia, or it looks like a mocking of scientific evidence when the same superpower withdraws from the Paris Agreement on climate change, which was an initial and very, very shy attempt to institutionalize a kind of collective responsibility for maintaining a livable environment on the planet. The European Union itself, which claims to be more supportive of multilateralism than other large players, is giving these days a rather poor image of itself. It has practically closed its external borders to refugees and asylum seekers, and chosen to ignore international commitments on these issues, or to say the least, to implement them in a very, very restrictive way. The European member states the European Union member states increasingly go as far as to prevent NGOs and humanitarian associations from rescuing boat people in the Mediterranean. And only when images of drowning people threaten to turn public opinions against them, some governments very reluctantly authorize the entry of a handful of migrants here and there on an ad hoc basis, but without a longer-term plan and commitment. I'm less knowledgeable about the situation in the South China Sea, but for what I read, the emerging superpower in this area, while claiming to be very attached to the idea of harmony, does not seek to negotiate always harmonious solutions with its neighbors. The looming environmental disasters, climate change, desertification of vast areas of the human habitat, the sinking of others and the rising sea levels, the fast depletion of finite vital resources, etc. Wherever we turn, we see red lights blinking and we hear alarm sirens sounding. So, on the one hand, the call for a strong pulling together of the world's collective wisdom, if such a thing exists at all, has never been stronger. On the other, the mistrust in any multilateral strategy, the reluctance of people and of political leaderships to accord their confidence to any transnational body or institution seem to have never been stronger either. And the term chaos is perhaps the most recurrent one in attempts to describe the world in which we live today. Chaos, graphically, may be very beautiful. This is a graphical representation of chaos, but less so in society and international relations. The system is gripped. Most of those mandated and empowered to act have no coherent strategies on global issues, blinded as they seem by short-term domestic concerns, caring about their image and their rating of popularity. And the problem is not only about short-sighted leaders and institutions alienated from their electorates. In other words, a broken transmission in the system of representation. there is a lot of that too. But even more, one has the feeling that there is an abdication of governments to the diktat of global finance and corporate interests. In the country where I live, in France, globalization has a rather bad image. The word designates something nasty and hardly graspable, definitely harmful, a phenomenon seen as being responsible for the flight of French industries abroad, for austerity politics, for pressure on public spending on education and unemployment, etc., etc. Therefore, it is not surprising that the Yellow Vests movement often targeted symbols of globalization, international trade agreements, expensive restaurants, luxury shops, and the President of the Republic, of course, seen as being too supportive of globalization. Somehow the Yellow Vests omitted to target employers, private entrepreneurs, and also the tax-evading multinationals like Twitter, whose facilities they use extensively as their own main communication tool. Some of those Yellow Vests marchers also wore what they thought to be the characteristic Gallic Hamlet, thus signaling their identity, their attachment to their land, their origin, their ancestors, implicitly their suspicion of whatever is foreign, cosmopolitan and global. Now, it is true that in the few past decades, neoliberal globalization has not only become unstoppable, it has affected countries and social groups in a very uneven way. It has reshuffled the playing fields of economy and finance within and among countries and continents. It has allowed millions in China and other countries in Asia to pull themselves out of poverty. It has also signaled to other millions that they are superfluous, that society doesn't need them, that they can simply walk away and disappear. So globalization has brought about abyssal, really shocking and totally unsustainable levels of inequality. This last point being increasingly highlighted today at a very late hour by some influential economists like Thomas Piketty in France. Yet the visible culprits when visible culprits for most people are those who insist on the positive side of remaining open to the world, those who argue that the solutions should be sought jointly with others in common fora. In other words, those who see multilateralism not as a problem, but on the contrary as something indispensable to address the problem. Those willing to look beyond appearances and to seek allies and solidarities beyond national borders. Globalization has come to designate complication, elite thinking, the intellectual class, politicians and institutions, all of them equally alienated from people's daily needs and concerns. Those needs, it is claimed, should be tackled as they once were by national governments, faithful to their people, their nation, faithfulness that cannot have a better proof than ignoring, suspecting, and blaming others. In the same line, electorates will not hail and approve policy proposals to be carried out with others in major European countries, but rather those to be pursued in spite of others, if not against them. Whether it is about containing the so-called migrants' invasion or introducing new protectionist measures, giving preference to domestic technology or domestic farmers, the logic is the same. When they claim to be directly responsive to the people, populist leaders and political parties today call themselves strangely anti-systemic. For example, the Five Stars movement in party in Italy, though there's nothing anti-systemic in the way they act, they are not anarchists. They take part in elections, they do take part in elections, and when they enter the government, they swear their allegiance to the constitutions as anyone else. The only anti-systemic, quote-unquote, aspect of their behavior is that they refuse to be seen as part of the elite. They reject the left versus right paradigm. They consciously nurture ideological and programmatic confusion. They take erratic, impromptu decisions in response to what they claim to be people's most immediate demands. Demands they have often induced themselves, but what I call politics of fear, ignoring data and substantive analysis of any topic, refraining from any constructive pedagogy and leadership. They encourage people to distrust analysis, to refrain from political thinking, to rely on what is presented as common sense, but that supposed common sense is most often a simplistic cliché, a single element willingly distorted, taken out of the context, expressed as a mobilizing slogan, as America First, or Take Back Control in Britain, or France's Marine Le Pen, Protect Europe Against Migrants' Invasion. Invasion, while the flows of migrants have been substantially reduced in the past years, at least in Europe. So we have an dominant anti-institutionalism and a real cult of ignorance, which unfortunately are the defining characteristics of these populist politics. One has to admit that the institutions, both domestic and international, are to some extent responsible for this faltering credibility. Political parties involved in many cases endless opportunistic maneuvering, and lost their capacity lost to a great extent their capacity to aggregate opinions and proposals and to represent their constituencies. Parliaments often host endless, inconclusive debates, very much like those in the UN General Assembly. The European Union legislation has become at the same time too complicated and too vulnerable to corporate interests. All this is true, but when you throw away institutions, you have most likely thrown away the baby with the dirty water. To use the famous saying, you are left without the instance of negotiation and compromise. You have cleared the road to violent conflict, to chaos, and to war. So what I wanted to point is that the link between the current rise of populisms all over the place and the demise of multilateralism. These two trends, in my view, are deeply interrelated. They have common origins, and they both feed on fear and the loss of a positive vision of the future. They support each other in many ways and multiply each other's pernicious effects. I don't believe any of the two can be curbed as long as the other is blooming. Now, there are two, well, I would like to end on a positive end note. This rather pessimistic story about the fate and the current disarray of what we may call multilateralism really is essentially, we are talking about state multilateralism. The United Nations are not in a good shape. They suffer from the spreading and strengthening of national populisms, from the Trumps, the Putins, the Modis, the Bolsonaros, etc. Luckily, people come together also without the mediation of states. Scientists, intellectuals, scholars, students, artists, bloggers, whistleblowers, thinkers in all imaginable domains. They are not shielded in any way from the rest of the crowd and from the contamination by national populism. Yet they could be more resilient to it. Today's whistleblowers and both brokers, both outside and within institutions, those who are often accused of spreading alarming news, betraying national security interests, those refusing to comply with fascist-like anti-immigrant injunctions and threats by some governments, like the two women, I don't know if you recently followed, two women captains in the Mediterranean were sued by Italian courts for having rescued shipwrecked immigrants. Those people are probably the bearers of a little light at the end of the tunnel. It seems today that the hope for a kind of new international social contract does not, a new kind of multilateralism is not generated by states. Yes, they are kept alive and hopefully may change, but what feeds any hope that we have today is, I think, two things. First, the awareness that the resources of the planet are finite, definitely, that we are using them at a pace that is totally unsustainable, and that awareness is much stronger among non-state actors, NGOs, associations, the youth, than among states. The awareness that all these issues cannot absolutely be tackled within national borders and with the dominant criteria of this very old and rather annoying concept of national interest. I would end on that note. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for this very insightful and historically aware comprehensive analysis of the rise and fall of state multilateralism. Also, thank you for providing some of what you call the a handful of the twilight at the end of the tunnel, for preventing or containing the continuous trend of the demise. Okay, so now the floor is open for any comment or question. Please.
Maybe I raise a question for everyone to discuss and rethink. I think since you there's so much time to talk about not so optimistic side of the development of multilateralism, and only at the ending you provide a positive image of multilateralism. So as a student of realist theories, I'm not so encouraged by your presentation about the future of multilateralism. But specifically, the question is about, you also mentioned the role of China and its rising into a multilateral world, and then maybe we can also call it a multipolar world. Quite ironical, China is an authoritarian regime, but it is becoming a main supporter of a multilateral international order and supporting market opening and other incumbent international order rules. And at the same time, the U.S. is quitting from many established rules and blaming other countries playing unfair rules against the U.S. interests. So how do you estimate this kind of ironical thing, and how do you estimate the Chinese impact into international orders, especially for multilateralism? And another, yeah, I just stop here, and maybe I raise other questions after your response. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for observing that, for your observation about my pessimistic view.
Mm-hmm.
And I just guess it comes from the fact that I'm coming from Europe,
mm-hmm.
and that Europe today is a pessimistic continent. Perhaps if I was living in Taiwan, mm-hmm. or in an East Asian country, mm-hmm. I would have a different view. Mm-hmm. Europe today, I see it as a continent made of countries where the social cohesion and social solidarity is falling into pieces, breaking down.
Mm-hmm.
From the very little experience I have from Taiwan and from some Asian,
mm-hmm.
other countries, Vietnam also, or some other countries, I have the feeling that people in the majority, I have the feeling, see the future as better than today,
mm-hmm.
which is not the case in Europe. In Europe, most people see the past as better than today.
Mm-hmm.
This is to answer your observation about my pessimism. Democracy and free market, China and the US, this is a very good observation, I think. Yeah, the superpower claiming to be the leader of the quote-unquote free world,
mm-hmm.
is withdrawing from multilateralism,
mm-hmm.
while the other emerging power, which is led by a single communist party,
right.
and rather an authoritarian regime,
mm-hmm.
is supporting multilateralism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we finally have to realize what has been obvious for some time already, I think, that democracy and free market are not married in a happy marriage once and forever.
Mm-hmm.
Democracy can also mean seeking consensus in society, developing political programs and voting on political programs that develop institutions, that organize society in ways that go beyond the free forces, the free play of market forces.
Mm-hmm.
But since the 1999, since the 1989, since the end of the Cold War, was seen, we won, the West won the Cold War.
Mm.
What did it mean? It meant multi-party democracy won the Cold War, and the market system won the Cold War. So implicitly, the neoliberal market and democracy were seen as happily married once and forever.
Mm. Yeah.
There are other forms to democratically manage a society than to leave everything to the market.
Mm.
Less state doesn't always mean more democracy.
Mm.
But this is an inheritance from, well, the development of liberal democracy. This is a historical process also. And I think it applies also, it becomes obvious in this contradiction, you know, that the US today are withdrawing from multilateral institutions while China is supporting them.
Mm.
I don't know if I
Do you think this
responded.
is endurable? Because some people still believe that the regimes like China or Vietnam, they play good in a multilateral or free market international trade environment. But eventually, either their regime, the type of their regime should change. Either they will abandon their commitment to free market, and once they get caught to the international system, they will go back to their old-fashioned style of rule. So how do you, because you are from former Yugoslavia, so maybe you can have a rich explanation or story for us.
That's a very, very broad and even difficult question. I doubt that China may choose to, in a way, withdraw from the international system, because the system has benefited China so much, and they are aware how much they benefited from it to kind of withdraw from it. Whether the authoritarian regime in China will gradually change, in which direction it will change, I believe you are in a much better position to judge about it than I am. Unfortunately, what we seem to see today is more rigidity in the system, and the system becoming even more authoritarian with minorities and with dissidents and so on. Now, on the other hand, there is a flourishing in arts,
right.
in many aspects of life. It's there is a middle class, very strong middle class already, and one wonders how that very strong and growing middle class can be compatible with an authoritarian single-party regime. And one also wondered for how long this contradiction may last. But this is, I don't feel like I think nobody is able to make predictions.
Any other questions or comments? Well, let me also raise a questions with respect to in relation to your presentation. I guess one of the most serious issues that is posing threat maybe to, at the global level, in relation to your discussion about demise of multilateralism, is the issue of climate change, right? And which also has a lot to do with, for example, rising populism or civic disgruntlement within European countries recently, in protest of the inability of the governments to deal with this issue collectively. One of the most sort of dramatic phenomena we have seen recently is the sort of collective action at the continental level in Europe, for example, launched by students, young people, to go on street or strike in protest of the governments, right? But there doesn't seem to be really responsive actions on the part of the governments. Okay, so what is your estimate of this, the prospect of the likelihood for successful cooperation or collective action, either within Europe or at a global level, to really combat effectively the threat from climate change in the near future?
Another very big question. Maybe it's a question of speed. Speed and resistance. What goes faster? The change of behavior of governments, humanity, and all together, and climate change. Some scientists say it's too late already. Too late. We are beyond the date. We cannot go back. The changes that have happened already are irreversible. The level of sea will rise. The air will become unbreathable, and so on. Governments seem to act, but in a very, very shy way. The primary concern of a government, of a democratic government, is to be re-elected. So there is a calculation. There is a mass movement which they need to acknowledge. And there are other short-term requirements by people who are not caught and aware and belong to that movement, whose primary concern, the yellow vests in France, their reaction, the movement followed the climate summit. No direct causal relationship between them, of course, but somehow the movement came after the climate summit. The slogan of the climate summit was, we are threatened by the end of the world. Those yellow vests came with posters, we are concerned by the end of the month. So how to reconcile, the government is constantly in a position to try to reconcile the claim of those who fear for the end of the month. How will they reach the end of the month with their salaries? And those who are increasingly aware that we are approaching the end of the world. And how to navigate between the two claims, the two pressures, the government, and this is something the governments in general don't do enough, because they have an interest in fear. They have, they are the order, and some fear is when you have some fear in society and they appear as the keepers and the guardians of order, they benefit from it too. So the point I wanted to make is that they are constantly navigating between these two claims, and what they don't do enough is pedagogy. The governments should be the forebearers, the teachers, those who raise awareness of the climate, of the finite nature of resources, of no, they don't they don't do that. They certainly don't do that enough. Why? Because they feel they need to respond to the short-term concerns of people, and they are under the pressure of shareholders, of the class of owners of capital. So that's all.
The tunnel is still very long.
Sorry?
So tunnel is still very long until we can see the end of it.
The tunnel is long. It's there is the famous curse of living in interesting times, and I think we are living this curse of have the privilege of living in very interesting times.
Please, any other comment, question? Yes, please.
You spoke about the non-aligned movement and about them having this idea and which they idealized about the new world order, right? They had this idea of the new world order. We didn't end up in that new world order that they had imagined and they had wanted. We ended up in some other world order, neoliberal and so on, with a lot of conflict everywhere on the planet. Now, do you see anywhere at all some ideas of a new world order that may satisfy everyone or most, and that of which we could sense some small sprouts coming up? Is there anything like that? Because part of the optimism of that time was having this projection towards a better future. Now there isn't much projection towards a better future, but maybe somewhere, somehow, nevertheless, can we compose such a new idea out of different, would it come up out of different ideologies, out of different orientations, out of different interests, different countries and places?
Yeah, well, the short answer is no. the short answer, I don't see the new order. I don't see the new order, but burgeoning elements of something new and something better. Well, I was equally subjected that I dedicated only 5 minutes, the last 5 minutes of the speech, to these new elements. And these new elements, of course, are understanding that national interest cannot rescue us from the end of the world, that we have to move beyond beyond this understanding of everlasting happy marriage between democracy and neoliberal order, that governments should be more pedagogical and more open to the voice of those who so far had no or very or not enough voice, maybe little voice, and these are all those who are likely to be the first victims and who suffer most from the old order. And these are well, I will say, migrants, women, sometimes youth and people who really can't visualize from what is happening, what they see every day, how they will carry out their lives from their graduation to their retirement age. It's much more difficult to visualize that today in most parts of the world than in the past, at least in some countries. Did I cover your? Yeah, order. The order is a funny word also, because it's a misleading word, and changing the order is also misleading sometimes and dangerous. So I prefer the first part of the question: do you see something new? Then do you see a new order? Because the order is, after the turmoil, you have an order. Then you have a crisis, and the confusion. Then you have a new order. I think we are in between. That's a very dangerous, of course. The crisis is when the old order is over, dying, but the new order is not about, or not its elements are not appearing as yet. This is, I think, Gramsci's definition of a crisis. I had a colleague, a researcher, an American researcher on Afghanistan, who once in an article said, and that was related to the peacekeeping and peace-building missions of the UN. He said, we often think about changing the order, changing an unjust order. But when you change an unjust order, what you get at the end is not always a just order, but an unjust disorder. And unjust disorder, meaning a stateless, chaotic situation, is sometimes worse than an unjust order. And this is war, this is chaos, this is killing.
Okay. Last opportunity for anyone who has any questions or comments. Well, if not, let's express our appreciation of your insights.